today we'll finish our unit on Islam by introducing the Sunni-Shia split and then turning our attention to the so-called culture wars that have raged in recent decades between Islam and the West. So remember back to the Hijra. In 622 CE or 1 AH, that migration of the Ummah from Mecca to Medina, which signaled the beginning of Islam as a social religion, a politically institutionalized community of believers as both a faith and a political order. Muhammad instituted laws, and this wasn't separate from, but very much in keeping with his calling. The revelations received in the Medina years tend to be not only longer, but also more concerned with social laws and a shared sense of not only cosmic emplacement, where am I in relation to like God, but also of a historical and political emplacement. At this point, the Ummah, with a place and a shared moral vision and laws, it became an established community, established on egalitarian principles, and not only for Muslims. Non-Muslims were accepted and protected, but they had to pay a tax. For the next several hundred years, the Muslim-Christian-Jewish relations were notoriously good. From the 8th to the 15th century, the Muslim-ruled Andalusia, or Al-Andalus, was an exemplar of more than religious tolerance, but interreligious cooperation and flourishing. But back to the early years of the Muslim calendar, following the Hijra, the Ummah had found its feet. But it remained harried, hassled, harassed from all sides. It remained under attack, embattled. Much of Muhammad's attention, therefore, and many of the revelations that he received were oriented towards protecting his community, towards what it means to fight justly. And what does it mean to fight justly? It means to define the conditions under which martial action is acceptable and appropriate, even requisite. It means to define what targets are acceptable. This is in part what jihad means. Jihad means self-exertion, the struggle to follow God's will. And sometimes, especially when your community is under attack and needs protection, this means fighting physically against enemies who would harm you and your loved ones. Martial action is absolutely central to what jihad means. In what's recently become a frequently cited moment, Muhammad is said to have told his followers that having been victorious in battle, they had triumphed in the lesser jihad. But the greater jihad, the struggle against evil in one's own soul, that awaited them when they returned home. Now, this story is lovely. It really is, and maybe it's something that we need right now culturally, and this is why it's been trotted out so often, but it comes from a hadith of dubious authenticity. Remember that word hadith. That's the secondary sacred canon. And it's very important that these are authentic, otherwise they're not taken seriously. This one is of dubious authenticity. It's not generally accepted as sunnah or traditional. And it very much stands in contrast to many, many statements that Muhammad did make affirming the militant nature of jihad. In all traditional Muslim sources, jihad almost always refers to physical struggle, to military action. And for the early Ummah, physical struggle and military action were real and pressing issues. There was a consistent need to battle. I'm like battling mosquitoes right now. The Ummah may have moved to Medina in 622, but forces in Mecca remained adversarial until 630, when, after 3 major, devastating battles, the city of Mecca surrendered to Muhammad as he entered it. He cleansed the Kaaba and went home to Medina, which is where he died in 632 without appointing a successor. I won't go into this in detail. You can find a more detailed narrative of this in the videos posted on Moodle, but in short, the major split in Islam between the Sunni and the Shia was a split over the question of succession. When Muhammad died and a leader needed to be chosen to follow him, the group now known as the Sunnis, a name rooted in this word for tradition, elected Muhammad's close friend Abu Bakr to be his successor. Following Abu Bakr was Uthman, then Uthman, then Ali, who was Muhammad's cousin and also his son-in-law, and those 4 are known as the 4 rightly guided caliphs for the Sunni tradition. Now, according to the group now known as the Shia, a name rooted in the word partisan, and as in partisans of Ali, the first 3 of these caliphs or leaders were usurpers without rightful authority. According to the Shia, they took advantage of the political situation while the family mourned. And there's the crux of the issue. For Sunni Muslims, leaders need not be in Muhammad's bloodline and should be chosen by the community. That's the Sunni position. For Shia Muslims, caliphs should come from Muhammad's own bloodline. Currently, about 85% of Muslims are Sunni and about 15% are Shia. The Crash Course videos do a good job of following the imperial changes that happen after the death of Muhammad, but I'll linger on the medieval period for just a moment to say under the Abbasids, who ruled from 750 until 1258, the arts and the sciences flourished. Settled and self-governing, the Abbasids moved away from conquest and toward trade, industry, agriculture, and learning. They supported Islamic scholarship, established schools, they built mosques. Sharia, or, this is the word for Muslim law, which you've probably heard in the news, and it literally means the way to the watering hole, which you can imagine would be very important in a desert environment. It's the straight path. It's the way one walks. Anyway, Sharia flourished, as did the arts. This was the era of the great Muslim translation projects when Aristotle, Plato, Ptolemy, and Euclid were all translated into Arabic with government money. After this immersion in translation projects, Muslim scholars and artists became incredibly creative. Algebra, geometry, medicine, science, art, architecture. Europe at the time was in the so-called Dark Ages, and it was through Islamic philosophy that Greek philosophy was transmitted to medieval Europe. Now, medieval Europe, people like Aquinas and Bacon, they really appreciated the originality and the thoroughness, the careful transmission and fruitful elaboration of this all but lost intellectual heritage, which, all but lost and probably would have been lost if it weren't for the Islamic scholars. But medieval Europe also saw in Islamic ascendancy a genuine threat to Christian rule. The Christian response was hostile and it was intolerant. Dante, Italian poet Dante, put Muhammad in the lowest level of hell in his Inferno, which was wildly popular even in its own day. And Christendom responded to the spread of Islam with the sword in the Reconquista and in the Crusades. Now, there were ways in which this was an internecine war, a battle within the family, sort of. Islam is the third of the Abrahamic faiths. Muslims believe in the God of Abraham and in God's revelations and prophets. As an ethical monotheism, Islam places a strong emphasis on moral responsibility and accountability. In all these ways, Islam shares a great deal with both Judaism and Christianity. Despite all these commonalities, though, and despite the global presence of Islam, Muslims were relatively invisible on the cognitive maps of most Europeans and American citizens, educators, policymakers, and media, at least since the time of the Crusades until the 1979 Iranian Revolution, the Gulf Wars of the 1980s and 90s, and the 2001 attacks on New York, Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C. That's what put Muslims on the map for most Americans. And as you can imagine, it wasn't the kind of introduction that would, tend towards a really easy friendship, right? Too often in the past 30 years, interest in and coverage of Islam has been driven by explosive headlines, polarized dialogue, and often extremist violence. We can see and we can trace the reasons for this, but we can also see that these conditions have obscured to many in the West the theological underpinnings, the aesthetic and narrative wealth, the vibrant ritual practice, the communal concern for social justice, these things that all also so completely characterize Islam. And I really hope that the last 5 lectures have helped to fill in a little bit of this. But all of this, taken together and with both generosity and justice, it doesn't somehow erase the militancy. So we'll close by talking just a little bit about that. Founding figures in the world of religion are generally exemplary figures. They're models of how one should live. And so the question is, how do we live then? Well, Muhammad did a lot of things, it turns out. He wasn't, though, a turn the other cheek kind of guy. It's clear that he understood that action is required, sometimes armed action, to establish a society where justice can flourish. You might not agree with that, but that's what went down. The militant Muslims of today all share the belief that the injustices brought upon them by the West can only be met with the revolutionary force of arms. Now, just to be clear, I'm not arguing that they're right, and in many ways, to my mind, they're not. But it is our job to understand, and if possible, to do so before we judge. If you agree that you must take up arms against injustice, if you could imagine agreement into that space, then the question becomes, is there injustice? Now, Muhammad was unique among the founders of the world's religions because he founded both a community of faith and a political state, right? He was a prophet and a statesman. And throughout history, when Muslims have been in charge of their own societies, laws, all that, there tended to be great toleration. When they're being oppressed, radically and miserably often, then moderate voices, all of the moderate voices, even if they're the majority, are discredited. and radical voices, extremist voices, rise to the surface of discourse. This is not true only of the Muslim world, this is true generally of history. And this is what happened during the period of Western European territorial expansion, or the period of colonialism. Now, with the exception of Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, and Saudi Arabia, all Islamic countries were once under colonial rule. And even those not directly colonized lived under the shadow of colonialism. In the post World War II period, modernity, the primacy of the individual, liberal thought, secularism, technology, it wasn't any longer an external colonial European force infiltrating Muslim lands. It was internalized. But those values came into conflict with the Muslim sense of an ummah governed by Sharia, and this led, in both religious and secular literature, to a growing criticism of and rejection of the West. People saying, free market capitalism doesn't equal freedom, like just because I have the choice to choose between Coke and Pepsi, maybe I don't want that choice in my factories, grocery stores, trade routes. Like maybe that's not what I want to define my community. A quest for identity and authenticity was manifested in a nostalgia for a past golden age of Islam, and efforts were made to recover and incorporate an awareness of native Islamic cultural identity, an emphasis on traditional moral values. So Muslims around the world began to see that their cultural dependence on the West had led to secularism, materialism, spiritual bankruptcy. Radical activists identified in the West a crusader mentality and saw jihad against unbelief and everything that came with it to be a religious duty. So until ISIS, Osama bin Laden was our most visible expression of this. He had fought against the Soviets in Afghanistan, directly or indirectly backed by the US, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and others. When the Soviets were defeated, though, he and his followers were alienated from the very powerful House of Saud because they did not accept the increased presence and influence of America in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. Bin Laden and others like him were driven by political and economic grievances, which were real, to draw on a tradition of religious militancy and justify and legitimate their own extremist path of violence, which doesn't get the same kind of stamp of historical veracity. That's an interpretation. Now, and this leads to the question: are all Muslims militant or extremists? No, absolutely not. The majority are not. But those who do have a traditional backstory to support their militancy in a religious context where politics and religion have never been distinct arenas. This is a huge topic and one that will continue to shape the geopolitical world that you will live in. But I know I've gone a bit over time here. You have some good resources posted on Moodle, and keeping up with the news is one way to keep current with this, and really being aware of the kind of news sources you're looking at, especially when it comes to questions of Islam or similarly hot topics. So let's all continue to work to understand. It's maybe not as easy as demonizing, but it is better for the world, and it might just help us all to build a more peaceful future, and not one of moral compromise, but of generosity and of justice and of understanding. So